Um, so I want to start today by just completely ignoring the history books for a second.
Okay, bold strategy for a historical deep dive.
Right, I know, but just bear with me. Forget the treaties, forget the politicians shaking hands. I want you to visualize a very specific moment in time. It is February 1947.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The war has been over for almost 2 years. And if you are standing in London or Berlin or Paris, you aren't really thinking about peace. You were thinking about freezing to death.
The Hunger Winter, that is what they actually called it.
Exactly.
Mm.
And looking through our sources today, we've got this massive stack of declassified government memos, economic data from the late 40s, and some incredibly visceral personal diaries. The details are just shocking.
They really are.
I mean, the Thames River in London had frozen over solid. In Berlin, you have families literally hacking down the trees in the Tiergarten, the Central Park there, just to heat their homes. The coal mines were frozen shut. The train...
The trains couldn't move at all. It was basically a biblical disaster layered right on top of a man-made one. You have to remember, at this point, the European economy wasn't just struggling. It wasn't a recession. It had completely ceased to function. It was medieval.
Which brings us to our topic today. Because the contrast is nuts. You have this smoking pile of rubble in 1947, and then just 5 years later, boom, a booming industrial landscape where production actually surpassed pre-war levels.
It's an incredible turnaround.
It is. So today we are doing a deep dive into the Marshall Plan and the West European economic miracle. Our mission here is to uncover how a massive injection of U.S. capital didn't just rebuild some bridges and factories, but actually fundamentally redesigned European society.
It stalled the spread of communism, and honestly, it basically invented the modern consumer economy as we know it.
Exactly. So let's get into the mechanics of this. Because one of the most fascinating details in the research pile was that money had just stopped working entirely.
Yeah, the German Reichsmark was so inflated, so utterly useless, that the actual functional currency of Europe became cigarettes.
Literally cigarettes.
Literally. If you wanted bread, you paid in Lucky Strikes. If you needed a leak fixed in your roof, you paid the plumber a carton.
That's just wild to wrap your head around.
The cigarette economy is such a perfect example of how deep the collapse was. We are talking about the complete disintegration of modern exchange.
So that is the stakes for you. It's 1947, civilization is hanging by a thread, and people are starving. And the solution that comes down is the Marshall Plan.
Or, to give it its incredibly boring government name, the European Recovery Program.
Right. And usually the story we get taught goes something like this. The U.S. wrote a big check, rebuilt the factories, and everyone lived happily ever after.
Which is a lovely story, but completely wrong.
Totally. And that's what we want to shatter today. Because when you look at the source material, how the money actually moved, the intense political fighting in Washington,
Right.
and the sheer gamble of it all, it was definitely not a charity project.
No, it was a Hail Mary pass. It was a massive piece of geoengineering designed to save Western capitalism from just driving right off a cliff.
So let's unpack the why first. Because in 1947, the U.S. Congress wasn't exactly in a giving mood, right?
Not at all.
They had just spent billions on the war. Voters in Ohio and Kansas were thinking, why on earth should we send more money to Europe? Especially to the Germans, who we literally just spent 4 years fighting.
It's a totally valid question. Isolationism was huge in the U.S. back then. But the Truman administration saw something in the economic data that terrified them. It was the dollar gap.
The dollar gap. Break that down for us.
It's simple economics, but with massive geopolitical consequences. Europe needed to buy stuff, food machines, raw materials, and the only place to buy that stuff really was the United States, because the U.S. was the only major economy left standing with its factories intact.
Right.
But to buy American goods, you need American dollars.
Well, Europe had $0.
Negative dollars. They had spent everything on the war. So you had this standoff. American factories were humming, ready to export, but their biggest customer, Europe, was completely broke.
So if Europe couldn't buy, the U.S. economy would crash back into a depression.
Exactly. It was pure economic self-interest. The U.S. needed a wealthy Europe to buy American products, but then you layer on the political fear. And this is where the Cold War dynamic really kicks in.
Right, the Red Scare. The sources point out this massive ideological struggle between two diametrically opposed worldviews, the democratic capitalist model of the U.S. and the authoritarian communist model of the Soviet Union.
And you mentioned the hunger earlier. There's a specific quote in the notes from a U.S. Undersecretary of State at the time. He said, Hungry people are not rational.
Yeah, that quote stuck with me.
It's the core of the whole thing. The fear wasn't necessarily that the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe with tanks tomorrow. The fear was that the French and Italians would simply vote for communists.
Because the communist parties in France and Italy were huge in 1947.
Massive. They were organizing strikes, they were handing out food. If you are a starving father in Paris and the capitalists are offering you a freezing winter and the communists are promising you bread,
You take the bread.
you take the bread every single time. The U.S. realized that if they didn't stabilize the economy immediately, the Iron Curtain wouldn't stop at Berlin. It would roll all the way to the Atlantic Ocean.
It's fascinating how tension dictated geography. Western Europe gets the U.S. aid, and Eastern Europe remains under Soviet authority.
Because the Soviets explicitly rejected what they called democratic money, they wouldn't let their satellite states take a dime of it.
Okay, so the motivation is fear. Fear of an economic crash and fear of Stalin. Now let's get into the mechanism because this is where the genius really lies.
Yeah.
The Marshall Plan officially kicks off in 1948, and the headline number is $13 billion.
Which is roughly $150 billion in today's money.
Right. And here's where I want to push back a little on the standard narrative. Because I was looking at these numbers. $150 billion is a lot of money.
It is.
But we're talking about rebuilding 16 different countries. France, the UK, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands. These are heavily damaged nations. Spread out over 4 years, that is not actually that much cash per person.
No, it really isn't.
It accounted for roughly 10% of the entire U.S. federal budget at the time, which is huge for the U.S. But how does that specific amount of money fix a whole continent?
I am so glad you caught that in the sources. Because you are exactly right. If they had just handed out $13 billion in cash to individuals, it would have been gone in a month. Eaten, literally. It wouldn't have done a single long-term thing.
So what was the trick? How do they leverage it?
The secret sauce of the Marshall Plan was something called counterpart funds. This is the absolute genius part that almost always gets left out of the high school history books.
Walk us through counterpart funds. How does that actually work on the ground?
Okay, so imagine you are the French government. You need wheat because your people are hungry. You request wheat from the Marshall Plan.
Okay.
The U.S. government takes Marshall Plan dollars, buys the wheat from an American farmer in Kansas, which keeps the American economy going, and ships that wheat to Paris.
So now France has the free wheat.
Right, but the U.S. doesn't just say, here, have some free wheat, distribute it. The French government takes that wheat and sells it to its own internal distributors and bakeries for French francs, the local currency.
Oh, wow. So the French government now has a massive pile of cash francs from selling the free American wheat.
Exactly. And here's the rule. They couldn't just spend those francs on whatever they wanted. They had to put that money into a special restricted account, a counterpart fund. And that fund was jointly controlled by the U.S. and the French government.
And what could they spend it on?
Long-term investment, reconstruction. It had to be used to build a bridge or a new power plant or to give a low-interest loan to a factory so they could buy new machinery.
That is brilliant. It is a double impact. The physical goods solve the immediate shortage, the hunger, but the payment for those goods gets recycled into long-term infrastructure.
It is a massive multiplier effect, and it forced these European governments to balance their budgets and invest in capital projects. They couldn't just use it to pay off war debts or fund bloated social programs. It forced them to rebuild the actual skeleton of their economies.
And there's another string attached to, right? The notes mention the OEEC.
Yes, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. Basically, the U.S. said, look, we aren't writing 16 separate checks. You guys have to get in a room, agree on who needs what, and you have to lower your trade barriers with each other.
Which is wildly ironic because these countries had spent the last century literally shooting at each other.
And now they had to share a bank account. It was the forced integration of the European economy. The OEEC was essentially the grandfather of the European Union, and it was basically forced into existence by American accountants.
Okay, so that is the machine. Counterpart funds, forced cooperation, massive infrastructure investment. By 1950, industrial output had generally surpassed pre-war levels.
A phenomenal success.
But now I want to look at the star student of this whole program. Because the Marshall Plan worked everywhere, but it really worked in West Germany.
The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle.
Yes, but this wasn't an easy sell at all. We touched on this earlier. The U.S. public was wary. But the French. Reading the diplomatic cables, the French must have been furious. They wanted Germany weak.
Oh, the French wanted to turn Germany into a literal goat pasture. They wanted to completely deindustrialize it so it could never, ever attack them again.
Which makes sense given the history.
Totally. But the U.S. State Department, specifically George Marshall and his advisors, realized a very hard truth. You cannot have a wealthy, stable Europe with a starving black hole of a Germany right in the middle.
Because it's the industrial heart of the continent.
Exactly. If the heart starves, the limbs die. Germany had the coal, it had the rivers, it had the heavy industry potential. So the U.S. dragged the French kicking and screaming into the idea that West Germany had to be rebuilt.
But the miracle in Germany wasn't just about the American money. And this is probably my favorite story in the whole research stack. We have to talk about Ludwig Erhard.
The fat man with the cigar. He is an absolute legend in economic history.
So set the scene for us. It's 1948. West Germany is still a mess. The currency is worthless. We are still in the cigarette economy. And Erhard is put in charge of the economy under the U.S. occupation. What does he actually do?
Well, you have to understand that U.S. generals, specifically General Lucius Clay, liked control. They had strict price controls on everything to try and manage the chaos. Bread costs exactly this much. Milk costs exactly this much.
Standard rationing stuff.
But the problem is when you fix prices artificially low, farmers just stop selling. Why sell your eggs for worthless paper money at a massive loss? So the shops were completely empty.
So Erhard decides to basically go rogue.
He does, on a Sunday. And that is the key detail. He did it on a Sunday because he knew the American generals would be out of the office or asleep. He went on the radio and announced that he was introducing a brand new currency, the Deutschmark, and simultaneously abolishing all price controls.
He just let the market rip. No warning.
Completely let it rip. And the next morning, General Clay calls him in absolutely furious. The story goes that Clay yelled, "Herr Erhard, my advisors tell me you are making a terrible mistake."
And Erhard's response is amazing.
Puffing on his cigar, he says, "Don't worry, General, my advisors tell me the exact same thing."
That takes some serious nerve. But what actually happened on Monday morning when the shops opened?
It was like flipping a light switch. Suddenly, goods just appeared out of nowhere. Farmers brought their produce to market because they could get real prices and real money, the new Deutschmark. The black market vanished overnight. The shops just filled up.
That is the miracle.
That was the spark. The Marshall Plan provided the fuel, the raw materials, the factory machinery. But Erhard's free market reforms provided the engine. And the result was staggering.
The stat in the notes here blew my mind. By 1955, West Germany's economic output was larger than that of the entire German nation prior to the war.
It's incredible. And it validated the democratic capitalist model.
Yeah.
It became the economic foundation for political stability in a region that had been the epicenter of global conflict for decades.
And just to contrast that, because I think this is an important nuance from the sources, look at the UK, the United Kingdom actually got the largest share of Marshall Plan aid, more than France, more than Germany. But they didn't experience the same miracle. Why is that?
It is a great counterpoint, and the historians argue about this a lot. The UK used a lot of that Marshall Plan money to simply pay off war debts and to prop up the value of the pound globally.
So they're looking backward.
Exactly. They didn't invest as heavily in modernizing their domestic industry. They tried to hold on to their old imperial economy. Germany, on the other hand, because it had been completely destroyed, had to build everything brand new. New factories, new machines, new processes.
So by the mid-50s, Germany had the most modern industrial base in Europe, while Britain was still running on Victorian infrastructure.
It's the sheer advantage of the clean slate. Sometimes starting from zero forces you to be better.
That is a tough pill to swallow if you're the UK. The loser of the war ends up with the better factories.
History's full of those ironies.
So we have the industrial recovery. The steel mills are pumping. The trains are running again. But the sources are very clear that the Marshall Plan wasn't just about heavy industry and geopolitics.
Yeah.
It was about fundamentally changing the lifestyle of Europe.
Right. We are moving from the reconstruction and production phase into the consumption phase.
Yeah.
And this is where we start talking about the Americanization of Europe.
Or coca colonization, as the critics called it.
Yes. And the critics were very loud. You have to remember, European intellectuals, especially in France, looked at American culture and saw it as incredibly shallow. They saw refrigerators and washing machines and Hollywood movies and thought, we are selling our deep cultural soul for shiny household appliances.
But the average person, the average factory worker in Munich or Milan,
They absolutely loved it, because you have to remember what daily life was actually like before this. Laundry was a back-breaking, all-day task for women. A refrigerator meant you didn't have to walk to the market every single day.
the Marshall Plan didn't just export steel, it exported the American dream.
Precisely. It exported this brand new economic idea, that a nation's health is dependent on the public buying things. The U.S. wanted to create a middle class in Europe that looked exactly like the middle class in Ohio. High wages, high productivity, and high consumption.
Cars, washing machines, new clothing.
Yes, all of those became symbols of success.
And this ties directly back to the anti-communist strategy, doesn't it?
It is the absolute core of the strategy. There's a famous debate called the Kitchen Debate later in the Cold War between Nixon and Khrushchev, but the actual concept starts right here in the late 40s.
Explain that concept.
The idea is simple. If a worker has a car, a washing machine, and a mortgage, they are fully invested in the system. They have something to lose. They are not going to hit the streets and start a communist revolution.
Comfort kills radicalism.
Exactly. You don't just fight communism with police and tanks, you fight it with Tupperware. You fight it with blue jeans and supermarkets. The fundamental belief was that a comfortable consumer society is a stable democratic society.
And looking back at the sources and just looking at the world today, it's really hard to argue with the results. I mean, look at Western Europe now. It is exactly what the Marshall Plan planners envisioned. It's integrated, democratic, consumerist, and largely peaceful.
It really is. It is arguably the single most successful foreign policy initiative in the history of the United States,
Right.
maybe even in modern global history.
But reading through all this, it really makes you think. We look at Europe today, the cafes, the open borders, the general prosperity, and we tend to think, oh, that is just Europe. That is just how it naturally evolved.
But it wasn't natural, and it definitely wasn't inevitable. That is the key takeaway from all these documents. In 1947, Europe was teetering on the verge of becoming a collection of starving authoritarian police states. The Europe we know today was built, it was engineered, and it was paid for.
It was a highly designed outcome.
It was, and I think it raises a really profound question for the modern world.
I was just thinking that same thing.
Yeah.
Because we see massive aid packages today. We see the Belt and Road Initiative from China. We see huge international loans to the Global South.
And we really need to look at all of those through the lens of the Marshall Plan. Because when a superpower invests billions of dollars in a foreign region, they aren't just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts to build roads.
They're buying a future.
They are trying to export their specific system and their worldview.
The Marshall Plan exported democracy and capitalism using wheat and washing machines. So the question for you listening today is, who is building the next world, and what exactly are they selling?
And maybe more importantly, what is the counterpart fund of today? What are the hidden strings attached to that money? Because there are always strings.
Always. That is a fascinating thought to chew on. From the frozen Thames and cigarette economies to the modern European supermarket, it has been a wild ride. Thanks for unpacking all this with us.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you for joining us. We will see you in the next deep dive. Take care.